May it please this chamber, Your Honors, on this solemn occasion, mankind is once again assembled before an international tribunal to begin the sober and steady climb upwards toward the towering summit of justice. The path will be strewn with the bones of the dead, the moans of the mutilated, the cries of agony of the tortured, echoing down into the valley of death below. Horrors beyond the imagination will slide into this hallowed hall as this trek upward comes to a most certain and just conclusion.
Clearly there was decisions that had to be made along the way, and a decision that Robert Jackson struggled with the Allies was who the defendants would be and for what reason they were decided. And sometimes the world of judicial expediency, political expediency become a factor. As you initially decided who your defendants would be, how did you go through that process? Walk me through the gymnastics.
Well, at first what I had was a workable mandate. And I think, and I've said this many times before, that the UN Security Council gave me a mandate which I could actually do. I could actually finish this. I could actually accomplish the mission given. My sister tribunals in Rwanda and in Yugoslavia had these vague mandates, which just did not put it in a way that could be done in an politically acceptable time frame. So my mandate was to prosecute those who bear the greatest responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that is a significant shift from most responsible or from just responsible. And they got it right, because I was able to winnow this down to those who truly created the pain and suffering for 10 years in West Africa. Clearly a Nuremberg model as far as the top 23. Now, I didn't use the, quote, top 23. I followed the law and the facts as they were presented to me, but it ended up being, as far as those who caused this horror for 10 years in West Africa, about 20 people, 13 of which I indicted. Others were either killed, not by me, but just by circumstance, or we turned. They were the least of greatest responsibility who opened up the entire case. It's very much like taking on a drug cartel. Not everybody's going to go down for the big guy. The guy's in the center, which is what I was going after, and essentially Charles Taylor at the very center, and a couple of others. So we were able to turn these individuals who really just blew the case wide open, and these guys were going to go to jail for quite some time. But they were dead men if found out, just like any drug cartel prosecution. So we had to develop a very sophisticated and very airtight witness protection program, because not only do we have to protect them, but a logical sequence of family members as well, because they will kill everybody that's associated with them if found out. So we are taking families of 10 and 15 people away from West Africa and putting them in places for the rest of their lives, because they are dead if they're found. So again, greatest responsibility. That ended up being about 13 individuals. And that was good and important, and we began to build our case based on my prosecution strategy. But a bright red theme, and it starts at Nuremberg and even before Nuremberg, even the consideration of what do we do with the three pashas who killed the Armenians, the Kaiser right after World War I, those type of individuals. Politics is the bright red theme in all international tribunals, and it clearly is Nuremberg, and it clearly is today. So you have to consider the political ramifications of what you're about to do, because if you don't do that, you can literally, as I like to say maybe too many times, you throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can have such a political pushback on what you've done or about to do that you lose not only the political support, but the critical financial support. even though countries do not tell you what to do as far as your prosecutorial decisions. That's unethical, and I've never stood for it. And then I found in my 4 years in doing this in some form or another, I found that was never the case. But the politics is there. The politics always has to be considered. So as I began to develop the cases, it became very clear to me that Charles Taylor, a sitting head of state, was clearly culpable, clearly greatest responsibility, clearly someone that had to be dealt with. And so I understood that, not just from a legal point of view, but I realized that there have been only one other person, actually a sitting head of state, ever to be indicted, and that was Slobodan Milosevic. Charles Taylor is the first African head of state ever to be indicted. It's never been done before. What is that going to do with your position physically in an African country, in a region, but also what kind of blowback is that going to have from the Western countries who are, even though they are all for justice and crimes against humanity, stamping out the beast of impunity and all of those rhetorical terms, unless it affects them. And even though the Rome Statute and modern-day international criminal law is going towards there is no head of state immunity, that is still a rock-solid sovereignty issue that has been around for 500 years since the Treaty of Westphalia. Indicting sitting head of states for what they do as head of states is a very difficult proposition, and it's only been through modern international criminal law that we see that doctrine being whittled away. But we have a strong customary international law and a doctrine that actually pushes all that away. So how do you crack that granite? It's not just cement, it is granite. It is lava rock that has been a cornerstone of international law for centuries. How do you get the world's politicians and diplomats? It was going that way with the jurists, but how do we get the world's politicians and diplomats to swallow that square pill? And it's a large square pill, and it'll hurt going down. So that's the challenge of this, because if you do something that actually causes diplomats and politicians to be unhappy, then they show their displeasure by not giving you money.
Talk to me about the mental gymnastics. You're sitting in a room like this, you're sitting around with fellow prosecutors, and you got to say, all right, guys, let's talk about Charles Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
What's the conversation?
Well, of course, you have to, and not only do you have to consider the politics, but you actually have to just the practical reality of what you're about to do. This is the most powerful warlord in Africa. This man is already responsible for the forcible displacement internally and externally of over 5 million human beings. He is potentially culpable of the murder, rape, maiming, and mutilation of well over 1 million human beings in the 10-year period. This individual has contacts throughout the world, has direct association with Muammar Gaddafi and all of the other old boys clubs in Africa. What does that mean? What if I take this guy down in Africa? What is he going to do? What is he going? Is he going to start grabbing my young junior trial counsel and shipping them back to me one piece at a time until I drop the indictment? I don't know. This is a criminal. This is a hoodlum. This is a thug. This is an individual who knows how to deal with life in its most brutal sense. And he will do it in order to save his skin. This is a man who has sucked over $450 million worth of diamonds, gold, and timber from the region, and has it placed in various offshore accounts throughout the world. This is a guy who will look at somebody and flay them alive just because he can. No respect for the law. A very charismatic person, someone who can convince people like Jimmy Carter and Jesse Jackson that he's a born-again Christian, and one of them, and I can't remember off the top of my head, one of those two called Charles Taylor the Nelson Mandela of West Africa. An individual who knows how to deal with people, plays with people's minds. So how does that affect, in a practical sense, taking down someone that is so powerful, so deadly, so atrocious in his behavior that it won't cause people to die? And what you have to do is you have to weigh that in many, many ways. But there's a slight wrinkle here, and one that the rest of the world doesn't know much about, which is public now, and I don't shy away from it. Actually, there are two other heads of state who were directly involved, and I had seriously thought about indicting those two as well. Muammar Gaddafi of Libya was really the person who started this tragedy back in 1988. He has a plan to take over West Africa and then eventually all of Africa by buying all of the heads of state with great deals of money to influence geopolitically whatever he wants. He believes that he is the emperor of Africa, and he has all the time in the world, and it's his intent to, in fact, do that. And he started in West Africa by bringing in various charismatic individuals from around West Africa, training them in his terrorist camps in the mid to late 80s, and then shipping down to West Africa to start the rebellion. Charles Taylor, Fodi Sanko, Ibrahim Ba, Blaise Compaoré, the list goes on. All of them were either key witnesses or people I wanted to indict because of what took place in this West African joint criminal enterprise. So we have, in reality, culpable and legally culpable three heads of state. Charles Taylor of Liberia, Blaise Compaoré of Burkina Faso, which is just north of Liberia, and the granddaddy of them all, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, who is kind of a fair-haired boy now, but in fact still continues to influence subtly all of the geopolitical future of all of West Africa. He pays them a lot of money, and they're quite beholden to him. They'll never admit it, and it's always done in the way any criminals do. You can never trace the money, but it is certainly being done even as we speak today. So now I have three heads of state as we're now writing the indictments. Clearly, all of them are involved. Clearly, it is something that needs to be done. But as the chief prosecutor, I have to decide if I indict three heads of state, what does that mean? Well, it means is that the United States, particularly, but forcing then the United Kingdom, the United Nations, to cease the work of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Therefore, there is no justice for at least in Sierra Leone, the 500,000 who were murdered, raped, maimed, and mutilated, and over 2.5 million internally displaced. Now, internally displaced means they're leaving their home, like Jamestown, New York, and it's burning behind them. Mm-hmm. They're not coming back because there's nothing to come back to. Right. So when I mean internally displaced, it's just not, we'll have to leave the area for a while and we'll just come back, stay with grandma somewhere in near Chautauqua or somewhere like that. I'm talking about they have to physically leave the region because their town and village is burning and they're being pursued. So that's, in and of itself, a crime against humanity and a war crime, moving whole civilian populations. And of course, Hitler was the granddaddy of them all. But we have all of this pain and suffering that's going on. So now my decision is not only am I indicting Charles Taylor, but do I indict Muammar Gaddafi and Blaise Compaoré in order to see full justice. Well, again, I used to call them round table discussions with members of my staff, my lawyers and my investigators, to seek their thoughts and perspectives on this. And everybody had an equal voice, whether they were the most junior or whether they were my deputy prosecutor, Sir Desmond de Silva. And we quietly thought and considered all of it, and I always took all of that into consideration. But I wanted to make sure for collaborative reasons that everybody understood once I made the decision that they had a piece of it in the sense of at least they had their voices known. And it was from try them all and let God sort them out, let's just follow justice wherever it may lead, to no heads of state, let's just get in, get out, and finish this. My decision is that I couldn't do that. But I had a realistic expectation, knowing from my long years as a senior executive in the federal government of the United States and knowing various key players in the Bush administration, that we would literally end the court. It was hard enough for the Bush administration to swallow the square pill of Charles Taylor being taken down, because again, it's clearly the policy of the Bush administration that they do not like to see heads of state being brought down by independent international prosecutors. That's the fundamental problem with how we pulled out of the ICC paradigm and how we're no longer players but observers on the sideline. So I finally made the decision to indict Charles Taylor, who was the most culpable of the three, clearly one who symbolically was in the center of all of this. Campori was left of center, and Muammar Gaddafi was right of the center. And so I thought something has to be done. I have to show the people of West Africa that no one is above the law. If I don't do that, then they will not respect the law. You have to understand, when you go into places like West Africa, and I have been in some tough places in my 30 years as in the federal government, both as a soldier, paratrooper, special operations officer, intelligence officer, as well as a judge advocate and a senior intelligence officer and lawyer in the federal government. I've been around the world, and I've seen all of the good things that life brings and also some of the more horrible things. I have never seen anything like what I've found in West Africa. It was truly Mad Max Thunderdome.
Mm-hmm.
Entire peoples lived to the end of the day. That was their only soul. In fact, in some ways, there are still regions that are that. But can you imagine a place where, when you get up in the morning, your only focus is to live to the end of the day? That is literally how most people at the time were thinking. The law was a threat. If there was any law, the law was used against them. The law was used as a club to bring them in line. There was no respect for the law or any type of governmental institution. And so here we land, this big, tall, big-eared North Carolinian in the middle of Mad Max Thunderdome with the law in his pocket, and nobody in the place understands the law, afraid of the law at a minimum, and certainly has no respect for it. So how do you get them to even want to listen to you, and then from there understand why you're there? In some ways it was like, and I like to use this term, I was a spaceship. I was landing in a spaceship. The analogy is like if you've ever seen the old movie When the Earth Stood Still with Michael Rennie, who plays an alien that lands his spaceship on the Mall in Washington,
Mm-hmm.
D.C. It's the same reaction that I got when I would land in my white painted helicopter. It says UN in the middle of some place in West Africa, Sierra Leone. It's the same reaction. It was what I call the spaceship phenomenon. Not only did I represent the law and justice to some extent, but I was the first white man they've ever seen, the first blonde white man they've ever seen. You have to get past that first before you start talking about the importance of how the law might be able to restore them.
Yeah.
So, how do you do that? I know I've gotten a little bit off track here, but it's all part of how you begin to make your decisions, because first what you do is you go out and listen to the people, and you talk to the people, and you get down there, but you don't just walk up and say, hey, I'm Dave Crane from the United States. Kofi Annan has asked me to come and try to seek justice for you, and here's how I'm going to do it. Thank you very much, and an hour later walk out the door. I land in this helicopter. The ramp goes down, and out walks this tall, white American. People literally, if you recall the scene in El Cid when they thought he had killed him, the Moors, and all of a sudden the gates open and there's El Cid on his horse. There's a literal gasp of the audience or the people surrounding the landing zone. You're separated from them because the peacekeepers they don't know what's going to be happening. They've ringed the zone for security purposes. There's police. There's lots of cars. There's lots of guns pointed outward. So how, at this point now, I have to somehow connect with the people of Sierra Leone. If I was close to the town Bari, the meeting place, I always walked, and I would always head for the kids. And I would talk to them, squat down on my haunches, and just say, how are you? And I would touch them, and they would touch me, and then we would all hold hands, and we'd walk to the town hall. Many of them just stroking my hand. They never they can't believe it. What is this? Stroking my blonde hair. So you walk in, or you drive in, whatever it may be, and there is 300 to 400 Sierra Leoneans who have been abused and murdered, raped, maimed, mutilated, all victims. Everybody's a victim. A horror. Each of them have a horror story. And they've come to see this man who they've been told to be the chief prosecutor. So I would go into these town hall meetings. It was a town hall meeting. I literally walked the entire countryside. The first 4 months I was there, listening to the people of Sierra Leone tell me what happened. So you walk in, and there's another audible gasp. He's here. There'd be a head table, and there would be the village town officer. There'd be the paramount chief. There'd be the village chief. There might be the Muslim imam, or the parish priest, or both, sitting at the high table, and there in the middle would be my chair. And I would walk in, and we'd all get up and say the Muslim common prayer, and we'd all say the Lord's Prayer. And then I would be greeted sometimes for about a half hour by various individuals asserting their authority in order of importance, building up to the paramount chief, who would then introduce me. Usually done in Creole. I got pretty good at understanding Creole. In fact, I got very good at understanding Creole. I couldn't speak it as well as I could understand it, and there was a few times I got cocky and started to and made some mistakes as far as translation is concerned. So I always had my trusty translator and political advisor, Mohammed Suma, at my side. But after a while I could understand, so I didn't need him there telling me, so I could see what was going on. And then he would introduce me. We're at this high table, and when they say high table, they have it on a podium or some raised area, and you are looking down at the people. And immediately I realized that this isn't, so I did it the first time, and I did it every time, is I would get up, and they'd be startled. They thought I was going to just speak where I was. I'd get off, step down from the podium, and walk right into the crowd, and stand among them for 3 to 4 hours, listening to them tell me. Now, I wouldn't talk to them about the law. Being someone who has a master's degree in West African studies, who speaks a West African language, not the one that I was there, I understood the importance of West African culture. I have studied the poetry, the music, the literature, of course the history and the political science of the region. But I understand the culture of West Africa, and the most important thing is family. So what I would do is I would stand in front of them, and again, you remember, all of this is built up. These people think I am probably the strangest thing they've ever seen in their lives. And they're all hurting. They all want to tell somebody about their pain. Mm-hmm. And so what I did is, instead of talking to them about the law immediately, is I would say, look, I'm David Crane from the state of North Carolina in the United States. And I've left my family in the United States. And let me tell you about my family. You know, people are just their heads are starting to turn in amazement. Talking about my wife, Judy, how long we've been married. I told them about my children, what they're doing. I even told them about my pets, which brought great glee, because animals are either eaten or they're worked and then eaten. I talked to them about my 2 cats, Uncle Skeeter, who literally became the most famous animal in West Africa. I would be walking down the street, and people would come up to me, or I would go back to that particular part of the country, and one of the first questions I'd be asked is, how is Alpu Skeeter? Which is, how is your cat Skeeter? All the time. So I told them about my cat. I had a dog named Annie at the time. People start laughing and relaxing. I said, well, that's my family, and my wonderful team who've come from all over the world have left their families. But I want to tell you today, my family is thousands of miles away, and I'd like to be a part of your family. Would you let me do that? Would you give me the honor of being a part of your family just today? Oh, they would clap, they would cheer. Some of them literally stood up and hugged me. They would say, of course, welcome. And that tension and that strangeness flooded out of the room. And then I would stand in front of them and I would say, now that you have given me the honor about being a member of this family here and wherever it may be, Pujahun, Kailahun, Port Loco, wherever it may be, as a family member, let's talk. Tell me what happened here. And for 3 hours, 4 hours, I would stand in front of them without a break, letting them tell me. And that's all they wanted to do, was stand up and say, I lost my family. My wife was cut to pieces in front of me while my children counted out the number of times that she was being raped. And then they cut my children to pieces. And they let me live, but they cut my right hand off to take back to President Kaba as a warning. Over 500,000 people had that experience. This is just one person at a time talking to the prosecutor. And I would just listen. Sometimes we would all cry together, sometimes we would laugh because it was a humorous situation, and sometimes we would just talk and listen. And so that was important. Then I would, somewhere in the conversation, start talking about how the law can help you. And they would always ask me very sophisticated questions. These people may not have any running water or electricity or the advantage of having the internet, even though they know what the internet is and use small little internet cafes throughout the region. But they know the legal issues. I had been asked about temporal jurisdiction, subject matter jurisdiction, in personam jurisdiction by people who are living the same way that they lived 1,000 years ago. How come you're only indicting people from 1996 to the present? That's a temporal jurisdiction issue. Highly sophisticated concept. So I learned very quickly and humbly that these people may not have the opportunities, but they're not stupid. They are sophisticated, deep-thinking, caring people who want justice. You may hear from time to time, the West African people are peace-loving, they are like to let bygones be bygones, they tend to forgive. Yes and no. When you have your wife cut to pieces in front of you, you want justice. They might forgive after there's been some type of mechanism, a cathartic mechanism, but they want justice. And I learned that very, very quickly. So with all of that, and 4 months of this as we're investigating, and it was all going concurrently, and I had people drafting frameworks of indictments based on my plan and thought about who these 13 people are probably going to be, one of which is Charles Taylor. 2 others out there, I've had smart people thinking about Blaise Compaoré and Muammar Gaddafi. I take all of this back with me now, and I have to balance all of this pain and suffering with all of this politics and diplomacy. It's a brand new tribunal. It's never been done quite like this. I've been sent there to test the next generation of international tribunal, and that is a hybrid international war crimes tribunal. We have a little bit of the region involved as well as the international community. All of this balancing by literally creating the court physically from lava rock to an operating compound with a state-of-the-art courtroom. All of this is happening literally simultaneously, plus hiring staff, plus seeking and moving forward with our objective of indictments within 6 months. Actually, it took us 7, but that's okay. So here I am making all of these decisions, pain and suffering I can't even describe in this interview because there's nothing in the English language that can describe it. The politics and diplomacy of expectations by the international community about what should be done. And I have to take that and come up with a way that seeks justice for the people of West Africa in a way that they can live with the result. Because we have to build enough respect for the law that even though they don't like the result, they respect the decision. In the West, particularly in the United States, we take this for granted. It's almost a given. Take that and completely do a 180, and that's how you do it in West Africa. So you have to go out again and talk to them once they begin to trust you about how the rule of law is fair, that no one is above the law, and that the rule of law is more powerful than the rule of the gun. If we can get them to seize the law as a way to resolve problems versus an AK-47, then we are moving in the right direction. And I might add, Sierra Leone just recently held a presidential election where the opposition won without a shot being fired, and without the absence of UN peacekeepers. It was done by them. I'd like to think that some of the work we did there, these things that I was telling him, that the law is more powerful than the gun, resonated somewhere, because people did not pick up the gun. People did not pick up the gun when they lost. The other party accepted the transfer. We all hesitated. So with all of this being mine, I have to decide now who to prosecute. Who are the 13 individuals that I think bear the greatest responsibility? I chose to do it fairly and broadly across the board, all parties to the conflict, from the Revolutionary United Front to the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, which allied themselves eventually with the Revolutionary United Front, and the Civil Defense Force, the governmental structure that fought not the armed forces of Republic of Sierra Leone, but this militia-like group headed by Hinga Norman and hunting societies to stem and counter the destruction of their country. So I indicted the leadership of all three of those organizations, plus Charles Taylor, and it ended up being 13 individuals. The day
Taylor's was unsealed, wasn't it? I mean, you didn't immediately.
I sealed Charles Taylor's.
Sealed, yeah.
I sealed Charles Taylor's indictment, and we went after all the rest of them and took them all down in Operation Justice on the 10th of March of 2003, just 7 months after I arrived with 3 suitcases and nothing else. And I can remember signing the indictments in my office. I brought all my office together. We had a little ceremony, and I signed them one at a time. And indictment number 1 was Charles Genki Taylor, President of the Republic of Liberia. And as I signed that, and I next signed, I believe it was Samuel Balkery the Mosquito, because he liked to drink the blood of his victims. Then Fodi Sanko, and then Hinga Norman, and then all of these individuals who ruled this part of the world absolutely and with such horror. As I was doing this and I was signing them one at a time, the people in the room, particularly my West African colleagues, particularly from Sierra Leone, were weeping openly. They could not believe that within 7 months, in the middle of a horror story, that somehow the bright and shining flicker of light began to show in a place that had been so dark. This was on the 3rd of March. I said the 10th of March. The 10th of March is when Operation Justice was scheduled to go down. We took the indictments. They were reviewed and approved by the sitting duty judge. And I recall with great hesitation, because this is the first time, and in some cases almost the only time, that we were going to issue indictments, whether the judge was going to buy off on it. Because if not, then we would have had to back away from our plan. I remember getting a call from my chief of prosecution, who was in London, who took it to the duty judge who was there. And she called and he said he has signed all of them with no changes. It was a great moment, but that was on a Friday night. Monday morning was the takedown, and throughout this process, I had been, talk about politics.
We take down the service.
Take down all of the individuals indicted, but for Charles Taylor, in a 55-minute arrest operation all across the country. Complete, total surprise. You have to do it like that, because if you do it one at a time, the rest will disappear, because they all know who they are.
Sure.
They all know they're culpable. And when they start seeing this. So how do I get to the point where I can actually surprise everybody without them knowing about it in the middle of their territory? I'm literally in the hood taking down the leaders of the hood, to put it in a vernacular, and them not knowing about it. It takes a lot of planning, secrecy, and faith, and good old-fashioned politics. Because in order to make sure that all this is going on, where you have doing all of this in the middle of 17,500 peacekeepers who are in the country at the time, the Sierra Leonean National Police, the political backing of the United Kingdom, the United States, the Netherlands, Germany, Canada, how do you in fact maintain that interest? Well, what I did is I developed very early on in October, about 2 months after I arrived, what I call the National Security Group, where I brought in the American ambassador, the British High Commissioner, the head of the Sierra Leonean Police, who we were lucky enough to have was a British retired senior member of New Scotland Yard, who had been brought in to rebuild the destroyed Sierra Leonean National Police. The Chief of Staff of the British forces in Sierra Leone, who were training the Republic of Sierra Leone's army, reconstituting it in a way that was appropriate, and the Chief of Staff of the UN peacekeeping forces there. This was all done without anybody else knowing about it. What I did was tell them that I'm going to be taking down a certain named individuals, who I can't tell you at this point. I will assure you that at certain times I will begin to start warning you that we're going to do this. We started working with the Sierra Leonean police, who were going to assist us in doing that. I flew secretly to London, where I met with the British Ministry of Defense as well as the Foreign Commonwealth Office. And we began to develop a military operation where they were going to quietly but assuredly be present when the arrests took place. I also met with secretly the Chief of Staff of the UN peacekeeping force there, and I had to do that because the actual representative of the Secretary General was a Nigerian who was dead set against the special court and who was actively trying to get some of our indictees out of the country and send them on agricultural scholarships to Nigeria. That's another story, but I'm saying is that we developed a plan. This is called Operation Justice, as I said, that we started an information operation. So I would hold every month anyway interviews with the regional and international and local press in downtown in their press building, just to talk to them, answer their questions, what's bothering them, concerned, just kind of develop a friendship and dialogue. But where I would also say, I would be asked, well, when are you going to arrest people? When is it going to all start? And I would say, this is a complicated case. Certainly we want to do this correctly. The investigation continues. The trials will certainly be at a much later date. This would all be reported, and so all of these individuals who are potentially indictable are looking a year and a half down the line for even anything about to happen. There's not an untruth to anything I've said. I've not lied to the press. But it was intentionally stated that way due to agreement by our national security group to ensure that these guys are looking the other way when we come through the back door.
Right.
Well, over time, we worked this issue, and we met once a month in the British High Commissioner's house normally over gin and tonics, literally deciding the fate of an entire region of the world. And it was all on my shoulders to do this right. But I used these politicos and diplomats to ensure that they were comfortable with my plan, with my maturity, and my vision of where this is going. And they're sending back to their capital saying that this guy knows what he's doing, we're comfortable with where this is going. So everything kind of began to settle into place. And this isn't about me, this is just about a plan that had been worked out before I even left Sierra Leone. For Sierra Leone. In December, I began to give a warning order saying that probably in the next 2 months, we are probably going to do this. They were all amazed. I said, we're already moving forward. There will be those who bear the greatest responsibility. Probably 70% of them are in this country at this point. And I said, I will give you, those of you particularly who have a real important part to play in this, and I was kind of looking at the British High Commissioner, who hadn't told the U.S. ambassador what we were doing. I said, anybody who is directly involved in this will know at the appropriate time. So about 30 days out, I flew back to London and said, it's going to happen within 30 days. They began to activate their alert squadrons, their what they call their Spear Point Battalion that is ready to deploy anywhere in the world, who was scheduled to do training anyway annually in Sierra Leone about the time that we were going to do the takedown, which was always scheduled for around March of 2003. So they began to issue their appropriate orders. They also issued orders to the Royal Navy to send the West African Squadron just off the horizon during the time frame. 2 weeks out, I told all of the members that within the next 2 weeks we are going to take down at least 6 individuals, and began to ask for specific instructions. During this time frame, the Sierra Leone National Police has selected a trusted group of 80 individuals who were going to do the actual driving of the trucks, the arrests, all of that, along with my investigators. They began training quietly, but they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what they were training for. Also during this time frame, the Chief of Staff of the UN Peacekeeping Force, under the very nose of this Nigerian SRSG, who doesn't have a clue, I've never told him a word, took the Quick Reaction Force of Pakistani Special Forces who are in the force. They began to train vigorously on just a generalized mission of a Quick Reaction Force on airfield seizure, airfield protection, local area protection, and those type of things, and began to gear them up in live fire exercise. All of them, nobody knowing what they're really doing this for. Mm-hmm. Within a week prior, I'm alerted that the West African Squadron has left Great Britain, Portsmouth, and is steaming south. About that time, the battalion of Gurkhas from the Parachute Regiment of the Royal Army arrives at Lungi Airfield to ostensibly begin to train for potential contingencies. What they've done is they've, in some ways, right under the noses of the Sierra Leoneans, seized the airfield in a, quote, training exercise, so that larger forces could be brought in. Because at this point, this has never been done before in the history of international criminal law. No one knows how this region's going to react. I mean, we still have guns in the bush. We have people still in the bush. No one knows how this country is going to react to this. And then I also sat down, and I can recall this, our last national security meeting, saying, the indictments have been signed. It's going to happen within the next 3 days. The pucker factor in that room was very high. But because I had been working this politically for months, there wasn't a doubt in the minds of anybody in the room. So forces began to move and shift. The Inspector General of the Sierra Leone National Police began to move his forces, and we began to put eyes on target. All of the individuals who were about to be arrested were being followed by various assets within the region and the international community. We call that eyes on target. Mm-hmm. We knew where they were at every moment about 3 days prior to the takedown. Again, like I've said, at this point in time, I've signed the indictments. They've gone to the judge, who's given it the okay. The arrest warrants are issued, and on Monday, the 10th of March, I remember sitting in the briefing in the basement of the place where I actually lived, because we hadn't finished building the courts yet. The compound is still being built, yet we were already doing the takedown. We had secretly been building a detention facility on an island offshore to house all of them, under an abstentional, under a cover that we were just renovating as a matter of goodwill, a local detention facility for the Sierra Leonean police. In reality, it was the cells by which we were going to hold these individuals until we finished our own detention facility in Freetown. So that was already being done for about 3 months out, and it was ready to go. On the morning of the 10th of March, we went in, final briefings, arrest teams are getting their final briefings. The Pakistani special forces are deploying to a site away from the rest of the force on a, quote, training mission. The Gurkha battalion is in and has taken Lungi airfield. The West African Squadron of the Royal Navy is steaming just over the horizon outside. And the HMS Iron Duke, scheduled to arrive over the horizon and sail up and down the coast, invisible in front of everybody at general quarters at the moment of the takedown. Incredibly, it went flawlessly. There wasn't even a shot fired, to include arresting the Minister of Interior, who was responsible for most of the assets which we used to arrest him, Hinga Norman. He was arrested at his desk by his own people in the name of the people of Sierra Leone for war crimes and crimes against humanity. That is justice. He was handcuffed and walked out of the Ministry of Interior in front of everybody.
Wow.
He was put in a van. We had helicopters that had been donated by the U.S. Embassy, so couldn't use UN helicopters because then the SRSG would have known. Well, this is all going down at noon. Everything's happening at once. Everybody's being seized. Remember, we've been watching these guys. It was just all across the board takedown of everybody. The HMS Iron Duke sails into the harbor and begins to sail around at general quarters, just letting everybody know, don't even think about it.
Yeah.
At 5 minutes to 1, I was told by my chief of investigations, Alan White, that all of the parties are in helicopters heading for our secret detention facility in Bont Island. At that point, I was sitting in my office. It's the longest 55 minutes of my life. I was sitting in my office and I called the SRSG, the Secretary General's representative, Olusegun Adeniji, who eventually became the Foreign Minister of Nigeria, and informed him that I had arrested 6 individuals for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that they have been in custody and are being detained at an island off the coast. He was in the barber shop and he fell out of his chair. He was so shocked. He started screaming and saying, how come he didn't know this? And I said, well, it wasn't important for you to know this, and hung up. We had also alerted the world's press that at 4 o'clock today, that the chief prosecutor of the tribunal was going to address the world. Because rumors already starting. I mean, you know, between noon and we're taking these guys down, and the word's out, and we call the talking drum is very, very fast. It's one of the most efficient communication systems I've ever seen. Within an hour, the entire country, without use of cell phones or computers, can know what's going on. So word's getting out that something is happening, that the chief prosecutor has made his move. So at 4 o'clock, the public relations officer for the UN said that the chief prosecutor was going to address you, but he's not going to take any questions. He's just going to read a statement. And so I read this. I actually have it, the press release, which was handed out afterwards. And I began to read the list of the individuals who I've indicted. 6 of the 8 were physically under arrest. The others were, but there was a 9th at the time. We arrested 4 more about 2 or 3 months later. The 9th guy was Charles Taylor, but I read the names of the 8. These are people who had destroyed this region of the world, the major power players, the heads of all of these warring factions, 6 of which were in custody. And after I finished my statement, there was silence by the world's press just looking at me, blinking, just as you're blinking at me now. And then someone stood up and ran for the door. And it was just like you see in the movies where the press is flooding out to file their stories. This is the most important story at the moment. Now, of course, shortly afterwards, there was the invasion of Iraq by the United States, and we fell off the front burner rather quickly. But at this moment, this was the lead story on all the world's presses all over the world, except for the United States, who never reported it at all. ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN did, but that was the only. Canadian Broadcasting Corporation did. That was another story, another challenge that I had, is that no one cared in the United States. It just never was reported. But anyway, this was the lead story in the rest of the world. And I remember driving back in my security convoy back to my office and my home at the time at Seaview. People were literally spilling out into the streets, cheering, hugging each other, and singing. They danced and partied all night. Now that's how justice begins to change. And that's when you begin to realize that decisions that you're making related to who you indict are the correct ones. It's more than just the legal correctness and the factual correctness, but the moral and the political correctness. I had the backing of all of the major players in the region who actively participated. I instantly had the respect and backing of all of the people because I told them that I was going to seek justice for them. I said, don't believe my words, watch what I do. And at that instant, they said, he's correct. And that's when all of a sudden the law became a force for good versus a force for evil. Now, after all of this then, I've got this one indictment sitting out there, and it's sealed. And it's the big guy. He has no idea that he's about to be, he's been indicted. He is now an indicted war criminal forever. The only person who can withdraw that is me. That's it. I can't be forced to withdraw it. A judge can't make me withdraw it. That, once that signature went on that page, it was a indictment for life. Now, whether he's tried for it or not, but he's an indicted war criminal. So then now, how do you start building up the world's interest? Because at this very time, the war in Iraq is very much involved, and the world has just dropped West Africa off its plate and is moving towards the Middle East, which was a challenge for the rest of the time that I was there. So how do I get the world to stop, turn around, and watch one more time? Because I have one more guy, the big guy, the one guy who has really created it all. Because at this point in time, I've decided not to indict Muammar Gaddafi and Blaise Compaoré, because I know that if I do, that there will be no justice versus some justice. So off we begin to develop Operation Rope, which was the build-up towards a potential unsealing of the indictment and the arrest of Charles Yankee Taylor. In April, after we had arraigned all of these individuals who are now in orange jumpsuits in the detention facility, to include the very Minister of Interior, and all of these boy generals and financiers and politicos, whoever they may be, are sitting there in their jail cells, eating their jollof rice. Sure enough, I begin in April to start letting in my press releases that Charles Taylor is harboring some of those individuals that I indicted, and it truly that he was. We had penetrated Charles Taylor's inner circle with informants. Under the brilliant leadership of Al White, it was our chief investigator. We were running agents in the capitals of Burkina Faso, Liberia, Nigeria, Guinea, the Gambia, Mali, keeping us informed in general what is going on in those countries.
This is all under the aegis of your...
This is all in the aegis of the Office of the Prosecutor of this tribunal.
Oh.
So I have penetrated most of the inner circles of all of these countries, and they're informing me what they're thinking about what all this is happening. And I know that Charles Taylor knows that he has Sam Bakary and Johnny Paul Koroma working for him in Liberia. So what I did is one day I called a press conference and I said, Charles Taylor is harboring two of my indictees, Johnny Paul Koroma and Samuel Bakary. I stopped. that was published. Charles Taylor bit. He said, "I don't have them." I then responded with a press release saying, "We do have them, and here's exactly where they are, to the town that they're in," to include Samuel Bokhari assisting Charles Taylor in taking down the government of Cote d'Ivoire in September of 2002. Samuel Bokhari was Charles Taylor's general in charge of the northern forces which were splitting Cote d'Ivoire. And I told the world that, and I even told where his headquarters was, because I knew it. I had eyes on target. About a week later, Charles Taylor says, "Well, we do have them, yes." Never says much about Johnny Paul Karoma, but says that, then I said, "Since you have them, turn them over. You have an obligation as a head of state to turn over indicted war criminals for a fair trial." Well, Charles Taylor then answers back, and you can actually read this traffic in the internet back and forth of me luring him in, demanding that he be turned over. And what I'm doing is now the world is saying, "What is going on? This is fascinating." And so the world's press turns around and comes back.
Right.
All of this is knowing that, and Charles Taylor does not know that he has been indicted.
Sure.
So finally he announces to the world that Samuel Bokhari has been found, he resisted arrest, and unfortunately he was killed. So I demanded his body, which on my birthday, May 29th, 2003, he shipped Samuel Bokhari back to me in a box.
Okay.
I remember sitting there watching it being pulled out of the back of the helicopter, which we did appropriate autopsy, and we did forensically identify Samuel Bokhari. Indictment number 2. He was a monster of monsters. But I said, "Well, where's Johnny Paul Karoma?" And he never did answer Johnny. But we found later on that he had arrested, or he detained Johnny Paul Karoma, killed him and cut up his body and distributed it around the country. We've never found Johnny Paul Karoma. We believe that he's dead. The sad thing about the Samuel Bokhari episode is that, unfortunately, not only did they kill Samuel Bokhari, but Charles Taylor also killed all of his family, to include his wife, his mother-in-law, and his 3 children, to quiet them, to make sure that they weren't screaming for their husband. The world's beginning to think now, and incredibly I find out through our sources in Monrovia that Charles Taylor, because at this point the annual LERD, the rebels against Charles Taylor, were mounting their spring offensive, and they were moving on Freetown. The LERD from the north, the Model from the east, from Cote d'Ivoire. So you've got Guinea backing the LERD, you've got Cote d'Ivoire backing Model, and they're moving and they're closing in on Freetown. There's a move to create a peace conference to stop this and to settle the Liberian civil war that's going on. I find out that Charles Taylor is going to go to Accra, Ghana on the 3rd of June of 2003 to be a part of the peace conference. So I said, this is where we're going to do it. So as we began to, and during this time frame, I've already shown the American ambassador and the ambassador at large for war crimes in the United States the indictment. I said, he's indicted. Well, make sure that you take this slowly, I was advised. The UN knows, the United Kingdom knows that he's indicted now. We have a head of state indicted, the most powerful warlord in Africa. I said, well, I will unseal the indictment at the appropriate time. And so we began the plan by which we would then announce to the world that Charles Yankee Taylor was indicted for the murder, rape, maiming, and mutilation of over 1 million people. Our plan was to do this by doing it as he was walking up the stairs at the beginning of the peace conference. I would simultaneously hold a press conference and announce the indictment, unseal the indictment. 24 hours before I did that, I notified all of the significant players in West Africa that a significant national security event might take place in the next 24 hours. You was in the spirit of being a part of the team that you were being told this. And so this is to the Secretary General's representative, this is the U.S. Ambassador, this is the British High Commissioner, this is the President of Sierra Leone, And I said that you should notify your capitals appropriately. Well, at this time frame, I've also sat down with the registrar, who is the kind of the senior clerk of the court, who is preparing the arrest warrants for Charles Yankee Taylor. Our plan was that 8 o'clock that next morning, he would fax, email, and personally deliver to the Ghanaian High Commissioner the arrest warrant against Charles Taylor and the indictment. When I was told at 9 o'clock that that had been done, I sent aides with letters to each of those individuals, U.S., U.K., UN, Sierra Leone, and also a warning to the ambassador, U.S. ambassador and the British representative in Monrovia, that at 11 o'clock today that I was going to announce I was going to unseal the indictment against Charles Taylor, seeking his return for a fair trial, in a letter. They were hand-delivered to each and every one of these representatives and telling them to so notify their capitals. During this time frame, my special assistant is arranging for a news conference at 11 o'clock. Again, one of those moments where I stood in front of the world's press telling them that Charles Yankee Taylor is indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Almost one of those, again, those crazy events as they left the room to announce. Charles Taylor was also arriving at that very moment where 5 minutes after he had arrived, sitting around with his fellow heads of state, that David Crane had just unsealed a war crimes indictment against him, asking for his arrest and return to the special court for Sierra Leone. The Ghanaians grabbed him, took him out. He left within 10 minutes of his arrival. He went up the steps as the president of the Republic of Nigeria. He went down the steps as an indicted war criminal.
Mm-hmm.
They shipped him back to Monrovia, but he was politically stripped of all of his power. They chose not to give him to us. In some ways, I never thought that they would, but my intent at that moment was to tell the people of Africa that at the stroke of my pen, I could bring down the most powerful warlord in the entire continent, not by a gun, not by force of arms, but by the law.
Mm-hmm.
He never recovered from that, and 2 months later, in early part of August, he was sent into exile, where the peace process had already begun in Ghana. And this is important as an aside. When do you unseal an indictment against an indicted head of state who is now sitting down at the peace table? Do you do it at the beginning, the middle, or at the end? Mm-hmm. If you do it in the middle, you'll destroy the peace accords. If you do it at the end, when they finally come to an agreement after maybe a year, you destroy the peace accords. Charles Taylor had signed 8 peace accords and 13 ceasefires in his tenure as president. He was using this only as a way to bide time because he had a shipment of arms coming in that we knew of on a ship that would reinforce his soldiers, and they would push back the Model and Lurd to fight another day, and this terrible cycle would start again for another year. So that it had to be done, and it had to be done right then and there before the peace talks started. I called upon the peace talks to continue, and the whole framework by which Ellen Johnson Sirleaf eventually became president of Liberia was put into place that summer, with Charles Taylor outside and out of the process.
Wow. Have you written this story yet?
I'm going to. Certainly, I am writing a book. I kept copious notes, a diary, every day for almost 4 years. I still have a diary. I mean, I'm a diarist, and so I write every day, but this one was a very detailed one, knowing that history had to be written. And so I'm using that as my basis for my book, and it's just the day-to-day discussions of what took place from the beginning, middle, and end of an adventure that I had the privilege and honor of being a part of.
Very much so, and Syracuse played a little part of that as you used that little subterfuge, didn't you?
I did. In May of when all of this is going on, weeks before, by Dean Hannah Artarian to come back and give the commencement address to the Syracuse University College of Law class of 2003. I used that to show that all was normal, all was calm, And to throw Charles Taylor off, but even if he had a sense that something was happening, that having the chief prosecutor leave the continent and head back to the United States would be certainly something that means that nothing's going to be happening anytime soon. And so I actually used that invitation and that week that I was gone as a way of also, as part of a deception plan, throwing off Charles Taylor and keeping him off his stride. 2 weeks after I came back from my alma mater, which was a great honor, a special thing, we went after Charles Taylor, took him down, and now he sits in The Hague. It took 3 years to actually have the political part of all of this hand him over, but they did in March of 2006, where he will now and is currently being tried before a tribunal in The Hague, a chamber of the special court, trial chamber number 2, where he will receive a fair and open trial, and he is facing 11 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Today, and the many tomorrows ahead, are a beginning of the end to the life of that beast of impunity, which howls in frustration and shrinks from the bright and shining spectra of the law. The law has returned to Sierra Leone, and it stands with all Sierra Leoneans against those who seek their destruction. The ghosts of thousands of the murdered dead stand among us. They cry out for a fair and transparent trial to let the world know what took place here in Sierra Leone.